Hello friends, I'm Tim Wildsmith. Welcome back to another year in the Bible video. In this video, I'm going to cover Romans as well as 1st and 2nd Corinthians. As I shared in my Acts video, I decided I was going to read through these in one sitting. So I did. I found a day. Now, part of my little rhythm here is I've been reading for small chunks, like 3 or 4 pages at a time throughout the year. I'm kind of shifting that a little bit because I wanted to dive into these a little bit. So I have skipped a couple of days where I was really busy in the morning and I didn't I think Romans and 1st Corinthians took me about 45, 50 minutes to read each one. So I needed a little bit more time, but I really like it. Okay, start with Romans, particularly in Romans. I mean, this hugely important theological work from Paul. And I mean, we have the Romans Road. We have all of these verses, like these little chunks, these little segments that for me, I grew up in the church. I grew up in reading the Bible, Sunday school, vacation Bible school, Awana program. So I know a lot of these little sections, but it was really fun for me to just read it at once and see how it all kind of connects and flows together. I took a class on Romans in seminary where I spent 10 weeks diving into Romans, like in-depth study. But even this, and at that time I did do a read through, but I don't think I got as much out of it this time. It's just like I was really ready to kind of soak it in. And it's really cool. I think Romans is really interesting. You might know this, but Paul is writing to the church in Rome. Unlike many of his other letters, he didn't start the church in Rome. He'd never been to Rome when he wrote this letter. And so I think in part we get so much great theological weightlifting from Paul in Romans because he's trying to explain to the Romans who he's never met before. He's kind of giving them an overview. He really dives in at the beginning and he's making this case for who Jesus is, what God has done for humanity. We get a lot of the soteriology, the salvation theology of the New Testament comes from Romans. These ideas of justification and sanctification, redemption, vocation, all of that is embedded into Paul. And for me, it was really cool to read it in one sitting because you're seeing the big picture and how he's kind of piecing everything together. I imagine that this letter, when it arrived, would have been read in one sitting, kind of like I just read it. So really cool. I think that there's just so many, like I said, little catchphrases. There's a lot of highlighter in my Bible. I'm not sure if you can see this, but there's a lot of places where I highlighted things and kept going back, and because it's like, oh, that pops out. And even some of the things that weren't what I would say are like the most famous verses in Romans, it caught my eye. I highlighted here, he's talking about reconciliation, that relational mending that Jesus does for people and God, not just like the legal sense, justification, but also that relational sense with people. I thought that was really powerful. The connection between Jesus and Adam and how sin entered the world through one man, but how God was dealing through sin with someone else. Just really, really beautiful stuff. I thought the chapters at the end of Romans 9 through 11, where it talks about the relationship between Israel and the Gentiles, that's really complex. That's really, really complex. And to kind of, again, read it in the flow of everything he's doing, it's like he's setting some stuff up, he's giving you the big stuff, and then he's starting to answer the questions he probably expects are coming. Well, what do we do with Jews and Gentiles? He steps into that here at the end. And then he talks about, okay, the end, he kind of gets more practical. Okay, this new life in Christ, how do you live this out? Well, you need to offer your bodies as living sacrifices. That's the only right. He's basically saying everything I told you about Jesus and about justification and sanctification and redemption and God's work and all this stuff. Chapter 12 is like, okay, now you need to live like you actually believe this. You need to live like you actually believe all of these things that we say we believe about Jesus. Love your neighbor as yourself. It's so practical, right? It's very deeply theological, but it's also very practical. So I also love that he kind of commends Phoebe here at the end of the letter. I'm assuming Phoebe would have been the one carrying the letter, and that she would have been the one reading this letter to the church in Rome for the first time and sharing it with other people, which I think is really cool. It's just a beautiful, complex, deep, intricate book that, yes, I think Romans deserves to be studied verse by verse and really to parse it out and figure it out and piece it all together. Absolutely. But I also love the one time straight through kind of just soaking in it. It makes me want to do this on January 1st, read Romans, and then spend an entire year just kind of digging into it, so 1st and 2nd Corinthians, right? So now here we go to a church that Paul has visited. He started this church and now he's writing back to them. 2 very different books though, right? So 1 Corinthians, he's rapid fire answering a bunch of different questions that they clearly had. He started the church, then he left, and now stuff's coming up. He's talking about what they believe in Jesus, yes, but he's talking about like the life of spirituality. What should it look like to live this out? He's talking about sexual ethics. He's talking about leadership. He's talking about the resurrection and what they believe about the resurrection. So he's clearly like doing some pastoral care here, writing back to one of these churches, pointing out different things that they need to be focused on, probably because they're sending questions and they're going, hey, what do we do about this? What do we do about this? So he's really trying to help them figure out how to navigate this thing. Particularly about resurrection, he mentions this a couple times. I think that they're probably expecting Jesus to return sooner than he did. I think that's definitely what they were expecting. And so they're like, hey, people are dying. What are we supposed to expect about this? And he's making sense of all of these questions. Makes total sense, right? This is a new religion. This is a new faith. This is something that they don't have all the answers. And so they're writing to Paul saying, hey, what about this, and this? And he's writing back going, well, you need to think about this, and this. Like, it's really kind of cool to see that dialogue back and forth. And then for me to take all of these different things he's talking to them about, trying to understand what it might have meant in that first century culture, and then try to transpose that into what does that mean for me? How does this play out in my life here a couple thousand years later? That's heavy lifting, right? I noted, one of the things I noted was how short chapter 13 was. It's probably the most famous chapter in 1 Corinthians, the love chapter, but it's actually really short. It's only 13 verses. It just takes up a little section of the page here, but it really does sit in the context of the letter as like a really powerful statement as he's moving through. It's like, oh, he just locked in this part of the letter and like really hammered home there. So versus 2 Corinthians, right, which is a totally different letter. Clearly, and I did some looking into this, clearly there were some leadership issues going on in the church in Corinth, and there were some new people. He calls them super apostles. There's some new people who are coming in and maybe pushing back on some of the things that Paul had taught them. And so 2 Corinthians is, whereas 1 Corinthians is like different topics, pastoral care, 2 Corinthians is more like, hey, like he kind of defending his own leadership. He's telling them to be careful about other people. He's trying to there's a lot about persecution and the tension, right? There's clearly some stuff going on in Corinth that Paul needs to get back there and kind of deal with. And he says, hey, when I come, I'm going to be pretty firm with you. And it's really interesting to see that. You're kind of getting a little bit of a peek inside like the inner workings of these early church communities and some of the struggles that are going on. And yet at the same time, there's so many like famous little sections of verses in 2 Corinthians that it was interesting, like talking about not losing heart, talking about we are new creations, we are ambassadors for Christ, talking about boasting in our weaknesses, talking about I am content with my weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities, for when I am weak, then I am strong. Talking about for the sake of Christ. So there's a lot of like, hey, there's some tension here, but there's a lot that we can learn out of this tension, and there's some really good moments for Paul to teach these people and to challenge them to press deeper into their faith in Christ, but also kind of saying, hey, like, I'm going to be back soon, and like you're going to have to respond and answer to who you're following and what teaching. You got to be basically saying, be careful of who you let be in charge and to teach these communities, which really fascinating. So 1st and 2 Corinthians, two letters written at the same church, two kind of different contexts. Really interesting. I read these, 1 Corinthians one day, the next day I sat down and read 2 Corinthians. So I was like, man, these are very different letters, but written to the same group of people. Again, it shows you the nuances of the relationships that Paul has with these people. So I've really enjoyed these thorough read-throughs. I think that slowing down and reading a few sections at a time and really diving in is also really fruitful, but this has been a fun way for me to kind of mix it up here at the end of the year. As I'm recording this, I'm going to start Galatians tomorrow, so I think I'm going to do a video following this with Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, and Colossians, and kind of I always connect those four in my head, GEPC. So I'll probably do one video once I've read all of those, but that's where I'm headed next. So I hope this was meaningful for you. I know that reading through these letters is there's a lot going on, and so I'm trying to balance it out and do a little bit of like overview of what's going on, as well as my reflections on my time reading it and the experience that I'm having. But so much good stuff in both Romans and the letters to the church at Corinth that it's really fun to talk through them with you. And this is actually really helpful for me to make these videos because I get to process my own thinking of, kind of vlogging through having read these letters. But really great. Again, as always, if you have questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions, please drop those in the comments. I'm getting down to I only have about 75 pages left in my Bible, so I am getting there. I'm confident that I'm going to finish this race, so really, really excited about that. But as always, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate y'all so much. I'll see you next time.